On January 30th, 1943, Berlin woke to brutal cold, 12 degrees below zero. Ice coated the capital's stone buildings while propaganda banners snapped in the bitter wind. This day marked a decade since the Nazis took power, a milestone in what they claimed would be a 1,000-year empire. Inside the House of German Radio, technicians prepared for the year's most important broadcast. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe and the regime's most decorated officer, would address the nation at 11 that morning. His speech would reach millions gathered around radios across the Reich. As the moment approached, silence fell over the broadcasting hall. Göring approached the podium in his medal-covered uniform. The broadcast light turned red. Then air raid sirens screamed. This wasn't a drill or malfunction. The unthinkable was happening. Enemy planes were attacking Berlin in broad daylight, during what should have been the regime's most secure moment. Sirens echoed across the city, followed by explosions. The broadcast cut to static. Göring never gave his speech. The Luftwaffe commander, who had sworn no enemy bomb would touch German soil, stood helpless as unarmed wooden aircraft thundered overhead at nearly 400 miles per hour. Understanding how wooden planes could silence the world's most powerful air force requires going back 3 years to a desperate gamble that almost never left the drawing board. In September 1940, Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. The Battle of Britain raged overhead as Spitfires and Hurricanes rose daily to meet German bomber waves. The math was grim. Aircraft losses mounted, aluminum reserves dwindled, and factories couldn't keep pace with combat losses. At de Havilland's facility in Hatfield, a radical idea emerged. Chief designer Geoffrey de Havilland and his team proposed building a high-speed bomber almost entirely from wood. Air Ministry officials thought it was madness. Wood belonged to the last war, to fabric biplanes, not modern combat aircraft. Building a warplane from timber seemed like backward thinking when Britain needed innovation. But de Havilland understood something the bureaucrats missed. Britain's aluminum was running out. It was desperately needed for Spitfires, Lancasters, engines and weapons. There wasn't enough for everything. Yet Britain had access to something German bombers couldn't easily destroy and U-boats couldn't blockade: wood. The design called for specific materials: Ecuadorian balsa for the core, birch plywood for the skin, and Canadian yellow birch for the fuselage framework. These materials offered strength, flexibility and abundance, harvested from Quebec and Ontario forests, and shipped across the Atlantic faster than the Luftwaffe could intercept them. The concept was elegantly simple. Furniture makers and piano builders could construct wooden airframes, freeing aluminum for fighters. Manufacturing could spread across small workshops that made difficult bombing targets. And because properly engineered wood weighed less than metal with equal strength, the plane could fly faster. The Air Ministry remained skeptical. They demanded defensive guns and turrets. Every RAF bomber carried weapons and gunners. Sending an unarmed bomber into combat seemed reckless. De Havilland countered with a different philosophy: make it fast enough that it wouldn't need guns. Speed would be its defense. It would simply outrun enemy fighters. No guns meant no gunners. No gunners meant less weight. Less weight meant more speed and range. The debate lasted months. Air Marshal Sir Wilfrid Freeman championed the project within the ministry, fighting for funding and priority. Critics called it Freeman's Folly, convinced that a wooden, unarmed aircraft flying into Nazi Germany was pure fantasy, born of desperation. But Freeman persisted, as did de Havilland. In November 1940, the prototype flew. The results exceeded expectations. Faster than a Spitfire, able to outclimb most Luftwaffe fighters, built from materials German bombs couldn't deny Britain. They called it the Mosquito. Yet test flight speed was just the start. The real question was whether this wooden wonder could survive where it mattered, deep in enemy territory with radar watching and night fighters hunting. The Mosquito defied expectations. It looked almost delicate, sleek, twin-engine with graceful elliptical wings and a streamlined body that seemed shaped by wind rather than human hands. The plywood skin was smooth, revealing the craftsmanship of workers who'd spent careers building cabinets, boats, and fine furniture. Beneath that elegance was a war machine. Twin Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the same as in Lancaster bombers, each produced nearly 1,500 horsepower. Together they pushed the Mosquito past 400 miles per hour when most fighters struggled to reach 350. It could climb to 36,000 feet, higher than most German interceptors operated effectively. Its range exceeded 1,500 miles, and it carried 4,000 pounds of bombs, matching the much larger B-17 Flying Fortress. But raw numbers tell only part of the story. The Mosquito had an unexpected advantage. It was nearly invisible to radar. German coastal radar relied on radio waves bouncing off metal. Steel-skinned Lancasters and Halifaxes reflected those signals clearly, allowing radar operators to track bomber formations hundreds of kilometers away and direct fighters to intercept them. Wood behaved differently. The Mosquito's birch and balsa construction absorbed and scattered radar signals instead of reflecting them cleanly. On German screens, it appeared as a faint, ghostly blip, often not at all. Operators dismissed fleeting contacts as interference or equipment problems. By the time they realized their mistake, the Mosquito was gone. Germans called it the Holzmucke, the wooden mosquito, with grudging respect and mounting frustration. How could they stop an aircraft they couldn't detect and couldn't catch? By late 1942, Mosquito squadrons operated across occupied Europe nearly untouched. They hit precision targets in daylight, photographed fortifications, harassed factories, and disrupted railways. Losses were remarkably light compared to conventional bombing. The Wooden Wonder was proving its skeptics catastrophically wrong. Air Vice Marshal Donald Bennett wanted to expand its impact. Bennett commanded Bomber Command's Pathfinder Force, specialized squadrons that marked targets ahead of main bomber streams. He understood the psychological dimension of strategic bombing. Destroying factories wasn't enough. They needed to break the enemy's will and humiliate them publicly. In January 1943, an opportunity arose for exactly that. January 30th marked the 10th anniversary of Hitler becoming Chancellor and the Nazi Party seizing power. The propaganda machine was orchestrating a full day of celebration with radio addresses from senior leaders. Göring would speak at 11 in the morning, Goebbels in the afternoon. The entire Reich would be listening. Bennett proposed an audacious strike. Send Mosquitoes to Berlin in daylight, time to coincide with the broadcasts. Force the Nazi leadership to interrupt their own celebration and show the German people that the Luftwaffe couldn't protect even the capital on the most important day of their calendar. The plan was approved. 3 Mosquitoes from 105 Squadron would attack at 11 during Göring's speech. 3 more from 139 Squadron would strike during Goebbels' afternoon address. The targets were the broadcasting facilities themselves. Reaching Berlin meant flying nearly 600 miles across the most heavily defended airspace in Europe, over the North Sea, past the German coast, through radar stations, fighter bases, and anti-aircraft positions. The solution was flying impossibly low, wave-top altitude across the North Sea, 50 feet above the winter swells, below radar range, then hedge-hopping across frozen German countryside, following railways and rivers, using terrain as cover. The Mosquitoes would appear over Berlin before defences knew they were coming. 6 aircraft, 12 men, flying unarmed into the heart of Nazi Germany in broad daylight on Hitler's anniversary. The morning of January 30th, 1943, arrived cold and clear. At RAF Marham in Norfolk, ground crews had worked since before dawn. Mosquitoes sat on frozen dispersals, engines warming. The smell of high-octane fuel hung in the still air. Pilots and navigators attended final briefings, studied maps, synchronized watches. At 9:30, the first section took off. Merlin engines thundered as wooden airframes lifted into the grey English sky and turned east toward the North Sea, toward Berlin, toward Göring, toward history. The North Sea stretched below like hammered steel. Squadron leader Reynolds held steady as his Mosquito screamed east at nearly 300 miles per hour, 50 feet above the grey swells. One moment's inattention, one gust, one lapse, and they'd cartwheel into freezing water without a trace. Navigator Flight Lieutenant Ted Sizemore crouched over charts, calculating speed and drift, watching for the enemy coast. There would be no radio communication once they crossed into German airspace. They were alone. Behind Reynolds flew the other two Mosquitoes, 3 wooden aircraft racing toward the most heavily defended city in Europe, unarmed, unescorted, relying only on speed and audacity. The Dutch coast appeared as a thin, dark line ahead. Reynolds pulled back gently and the Mosquito rose just enough to clear the coastal dunes before dropping back to treetop level. Frozen fields blurred beneath them. Farmhouses flashed past. Startled civilians looked up at the thundering shapes. Then they were gone, into Germany. The landscape changed. Industrial towns appeared below, rail yards, factory chimneys smoking into winter sky. The Mosquitoes wove between obstacles at 300 miles per hour, following canals and railways, using church steeples and water towers as navigation points. Merlin engines howled at maximum power. Airframes vibrated with sustained high-speed strain. Anti-aircraft positions fired sporadically but couldn't aim fast enough. By the time gunners registered the approaching aircraft and rotated weapons toward them, the Mosquitoes had passed beyond range, too fast, too low for accurate tracking. Minutes passed. Sizemore called out checkpoints. Reynolds acknowledged each one. The cockpit reeked of engine oil, sweat and fear. Every second stretched. Every second brought them closer to Berlin. Then the capital appeared. Spires and rooftops spread across the landscape. Smoke rose from thousands of chimneys. Traffic moved through streets. Berlin's citizens went about their morning, unaware of what approached. It was exactly 11 o'clock. At that moment, inside the House of German Radio, Hermann Göring prepared to address the nation. Millions of Germans gathered around radios. The Reich Marshal stepped toward the podium. The red transmission light came on. Reynolds pushed throttles to maximum. The Mosquitoes surged forward. The broadcasting house loomed ahead. He aligned his approach and released his bombs. Explosions tore through the morning quiet. Inside, windows shattered. The building shook violently. Plaster fell from the ceiling. Technicians dove for cover. The ceremony dissolved into chaos. Göring never gave his speech. The transmission cut to static as air raid sirens wailed across the capital. The Mosquito swept over rooftops and banked sharply for home. Behind them, smoke columns rose from the wounded city. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire across Berlin, but the wooden aircraft were already accelerating away, climbing, racing west, leaving confusion and humiliation behind. The second wave was already en route. 3 more Mosquitoes from 139 Squadron crossed the North Sea that afternoon, targeting the same city, timed for Joseph Goebbels's 4 o'clock address. The Minister of Propaganda, the Nazi regime's voice, would also be silenced by British audacity. The afternoon raiders met heavier opposition. The Luftwaffe was now alert. Fighters scrambled from airfields across northern Germany. Anti-aircraft batteries stood ready. Still, the Mosquitoes came in low and fast, using the same tactics. They struck their targets and disrupted the broadcast. Then they vanished into winter sky, racing home. Of 6 aircraft sent that day, 1 was lost. A single Mosquito was shot down by ground fire over Berlin, its crew paying the ultimate price of audacity. But the mission succeeded overwhelmingly. The Nazi propaganda machine had been publicly exposed as impotent. The Luftwaffe had failed to protect the capital on the most important Nazi calendar day. The weapon that humiliated them was built from Canadian birch and balsa, materials they'd dismissed as obsolete. The impact reached the highest levels of German command, and no one felt it more than Hermann Göring. News reached Hitler's headquarters within hours. Enemy aircraft over Berlin in daylight on the anniversary of their seizure of power. The Führer's rage was incandescent. His air force had promised an impenetrable shield. His Reich Marshal had boasted publicly that no enemy bomb would fall on German soil. Now this. Göring retreated from public view. The humiliation was complete. The man who built the Luftwaffe into the most feared air force on earth had been made foolish by a handful of wooden aircraft his fighters couldn't catch. His radar barely detected. That mocked everything he'd built. Weeks later, Göring summoned aircraft designers and engineers to a conference. He demanded answers and solutions. During that meeting, he spoke extensively about the Mosquito, its speed, versatility, the impossibility of intercepting it. Then his composure cracked. He reportedly said seeing the Mosquito made him furious, that it turned him green and yellow with envy. The Reich Marshal of Greater Germany, commander of the world's most technologically advanced air force, consumed with envy over an aircraft built from wood. Germans had jet engines in development, rocket-powered aircraft on drawing boards, engineering capabilities that seemed like science fiction. Yet they couldn't match the performance of an aircraft built by furniture makers using techniques from the previous century. The irony was profound. German intelligence scrambled to understand the Mosquito. They analyzed crashed examples, interrogated captured crews, studied every photograph and report. What they found only deepened their frustration. The design was remarkably simple, elegant, efficient. It used abundant, accessible materials and readily available workers. It could be built in small workshops dispersed across countryside, making production difficult to target. Yet it outperformed aircraft costing 3 times as much, requiring far more complex facilities. German High Command demanded a German equivalent, something fast, wooden, versatile. But German industry wasn't configured for it. Their factories were tooled for metal aircraft. Their workforce was trained for aluminum and steel. The specialized skills needed to build a wooden combat aircraft of this sophistication had largely disappeared during the preceding decade of metal aircraft production. Meanwhile, the Mosquito force grew stronger. New squadrons formed continuously. New variants emerged, fighters with heavy cannons, reconnaissance versions with cameras, night fighters with radar. The Wooden Wonder adapted to every role Bomber Command imagined, and loss rates remained remarkably low. By war's end, nearly 8,000 Mosquitoes would be built. They'd complete over 40,000 sorties, striking targets from Norway to North Africa, from France to Berlin. Throughout, they remained the aircraft the Luftwaffe could never truly answer, but the Mosquito story extends beyond British triumph. Across the Atlantic, another chapter involved Canadian industry and pride. Demand exceeded British production capacity. In 1942, de Havilland Canada established a facility in Downsview, Ontario, just north of Toronto. Canadian workers began building Mosquitoes using Canadian materials and craftsmanship. The same yellow birch essential to the original design now flowed directly from Quebec and Ontario forests to Canadian assembly lines without Atlantic shipping. By war's end, Downsview produced over 1,000 Mosquitoes. Canadian hands shaped the plywood. Canadian craftsmen fitted assemblies. Canadian test pilots flew each completed aircraft. The program became a source of immense national pride, testament to what Canadian industry could achieve when stakes were highest. Veterans who worked those lines decades later still remembered the smell of wood shavings mixed with aircraft dope, the sound of rivet guns and precision lathes, the satisfaction of watching completed Mosquitoes roll from hangars knowing they'd soon strike the enemy. Those near-production airfields remember something else. The sound of Merlin engines, that distinctive rumble that echoed across the Canadian landscape during test flights. Mosquitoes taking off on training missions, climbing into Ontario sky, a sound woven into wartime memory, still stirring something profound in those who heard it. The Mosquito proved courage takes many forms. It vindicated visionaries who believed when others mocked. It showed innovation doesn't always require complexity or cutting-edge technology. Sometimes the simplest solutions prove most elegant. Sometimes answers come not from sophisticated laboratories, but from forests. Canadian lumber helped win the air war over Europe. Canadian workers built the aircraft that humiliated the Luftwaffe and embarrassed its leadership. On that bitter January morning in 1943, Canadian yellow birch flew over Berlin and knocked Hermann Göring off the radio, silencing one of the Nazi regime's most powerful voices.